My name is Diana, 34 years old, and my family threw me onto the street the exact same night they thought I lost my job. They gave me 1 hour to pack my bags in the freezing rain, screaming that I was a useless burden, ruining their perfect lives. They were panicking about who would pay their massive mortgages and luxury car leases, never bothering to ask what I actually did for a living. If they had paid attention, they would have known I did not lose my job. I had just secretly bought the entire company. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members who only loved you for what you could give them. Growing up in suburban Connecticut, everything in our house was about keeping up appearances. My parents, George and Martha, valued status above absolutely everything else. We lived in a sprawling 4-bedroom home we could barely afford, with a manicured lawn and a shiny leased SUV sitting in the driveway. From the outside, we always looked exactly like the perfect American family. Inside, it was a battleground of expectations. My younger sister Kendra was the golden child. At 29 years old, she was a real estate broker who sold 0 houses last year, but lived like she was starring on reality television. She had the expensive designer bags, the latest luxury cars, the flashy jewelry, and a husband named Andre. Andre was an African-American sports agent who always wore custom-tailored Italian suits but was secretly drowning in deep, unmanageable debt. I was the family workhorse. For years, they thought I was just a mid-level marketing assistant at a corporate agency. They constantly mocked my plain clothes and quiet demeanor. They did not know I was actually the ghost founder of Apex Prime, a billion-dollar branding agency. I purposely played the role of the quiet assistant to carefully observe my own company and plan a hostile takeover to remove the corrupt board of directors. But to my selfish family, I was just Diana, the spinster sister who quietly paid the bills whenever they overspent. It was a rainy Tuesday evening, and we were gathered around the heavy oak dining table in my parents' house for dinner. The roast beef was completely dry, and the tension in the room was incredibly thick. Kendra was loudly complaining about the housing market and how unfair it was that her commissions were down. Andre was aggressively cutting his meat, muttering about his demanding clients and terrible cash flow. I was quietly eating my mashed potatoes, mentally reviewing the final legal documents for my corporate buyout. My phone, sitting face up next to my water glass, suddenly buzzed loudly against the wood. The screen lit up with a bright, bold notification. It was an email from the Corporate Human Resources Department at Apex Prime. The subject line read, "Termination of employment." I felt a quick, powerful surge of triumph. The termination email was the final step of my hostile takeover. It meant the old shell company was officially dissolved, and my new entity was completely in control. I reached for the phone to swipe the notification away, but Kendra was much faster. Her manicured hand shot across the table, violently knocking over her expensive wine glass. She snatched my phone right out of my hand before I could even react. Her eyes darted across the glowing screen, reading the subject line out loud for everyone to hear. "Termination of employment." Kendra shrieked, her high-pitched voice echoing off the dining room walls. She dropped my phone onto the table like it was on fire. "Are you kidding me right now, Diana? Did you seriously just get fired from your pathetic little job?" My mother gasped loudly, dramatically, clutching her cloth napkin to her chest. George slammed his heavy fist down on the table, making all the silverware rattle. I tried to speak, to calmly tell them it was a corporate restructuring, but Kendra did not give me a single second to breathe. "You absolute failure!" Kendra screamed violently, standing up from her chair. Her face turned bright red with pure rage. "Do you have any idea what you have just done to me? My mortgage is $4,500 a month. The homeowner association fees are due on Monday. I am completely underwater on my penthouse, and I was completely and fully relying on your year-end bonus to cover my escrow shortfall. How am I supposed to pay for my expensive life if you do not have a job?" Before I could even formulate a response to her absurd entitlement, Andre slammed his heavy fist down on the solid oak dining table. He adjusted the crisp cuffs of his custom Italian suit, a suit I knew for a fact was purchased on a high-interest credit card, and glared at me with pure disgust. "You have got to be kidding me, Diana. He practically growled, his voice dripping with condescension. Do you have any idea what kind of week I am having? I am exactly 3 days away from the biggest National Football League draft signing of my entire professional career. I am actively trying to secure a multi-million-dollar athletic contract for a first-round defensive tackle, and I need my mindset to be absolutely perfect. I cannot deal with this kind of toxic, broke energy in my family circle right now. The sheer audacity of his statement was comical. Andre was heavily leveraged and drowning in hidden debt. He had taken out massive predatory business loans to fund his flashy lifestyle, desperately hoping this one sports client would magically wipe his financial slate clean. He needed my reliable corporate income as a safety net just as much as my sister did, though his incredibly fragile ego would never allow him to openly admit it. "Oh, you poor things, my mother," Martha cooed, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that her eldest daughter had just allegedly lost her sole source of income. She rushed frantically around the dining table to wrap her arms tightly around Kendra, who was now forcing out fake dramatic sobs into her expensive silk napkin. "George," my father aggressively stood up and pointed a thick, accusatory finger right at my face. "Look at what you have done to your own sister and your hard-working brother-in-law." My father bellowed, his face turning an angry shade of purple. "They are out here making real moves, building real generational wealth, and dealing with massive high-level corporate stress. And what exactly are you doing? You are a 34-year-old dead weight. You have been sitting at the exact same mediocre desk job for an entire decade, and you could not even manage to keep that secure. We let you live here comfortably under our roof so you could help support the family, and you repay our endless generosity by getting yourself fired." I looked around the elegantly decorated room, taking in the absolute madness of the deeply unfair situation. I was 34 years old, yes, but I had quietly paid off the second mortgage on this very house 5 full years ago. I paid the exorbitant monthly utility bills. I covered the massive property taxes. I even paid for the expensive weekly dry cleaning service that kept Andre looking like a highly successful sports agent. They had all miraculously convinced themselves that because I lived quietly in my childhood bedroom and wore plain clothes, I was a financial burden they were graciously tolerating. "This is exactly why you are still single and living at home," Kendra spat venomously, wiping away her non-existent tears. "You have absolutely no drive, Diana. You have zero ambition. Andre and I are drowning in real-world adult problems. We have massive homeowner association fees, luxury car leases, and high-society networking events to constantly fund. We were fully counting on your corporate Christmas bonus to cover the gap in our escrow account. You promised us that money, and now you have selfishly thrown it all away." "I never promised you a single dime," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm and completely level. "Your underwater mortgage is your responsibility, Kendra, not mine. How dare you speak to her that way?" My mother shrieked violently, clutching her heavy pearl necklace. "Your sister is under an immense amount of financial pressure. The luxury housing market in Connecticut is completely frozen. Nobody is buying high-end real estate right now. She is a helpless victim of a bad economy while you are just a pathetic victim of your own sheer incompetence. You should be apologizing to them for putting their security at risk." "She is absolutely right," Andre added eagerly, leaning back in his chair with unearned arrogance. "In the cutthroat sports agency world, we cut dead weight immediately. If a player is not performing on the field, we drop him from the active roster without a second thought. Families should be a team, Diana. Everyone is supposed to contribute to the ultimate win. But right now, you are just a huge, undeniable liability. If my massive draft deal falls through on Friday because I am way too stressed out about Kendra losing her luxury penthouse, that is entirely your own fault. You have completely ruined my winning mindset." I stared at Andre in absolute disbelief. The sheer delusion required to blame a 34-year-old woman for his inability to close a sports contract was staggering. I opened my mouth to calmly explain that my employment status had absolutely zero impact on his fragile professional ego. But my mother abruptly stood up. The heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, echoing through the tense dining room. Martha did not say a single word at first. Her face was set in a cold, hard line that I recognized from my childhood. It was the face she made whenever I failed to meet her impossibly high standards. She turned her back on me and marched straight out of the dining room and down the hallway. I could hear her heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. The rest of us sat in total silence. Kendra was still dabbing at her dry eyes with the silk napkin, occasionally shooting me venomous glares across the table. Andre was aggressively checking his expensive smartphone, playing the part of the incredibly busy executive who was being inconvenienced by family drama. A few moments later, my mother reappeared in the dining room doorway. Her hands were gripping the handles of two battered, faded brown suitcases. I recognized them immediately. They were the cheap luggage bags I had used when I moved away to college more than a decade ago. She dragged them across the expensive Persian rug and dropped them aggressively at my feet. The heavy thud shook the floor. I looked down at the dusty bags, then back up at my mother's unblinking eyes. "What is this?" I asked quietly, though a cold knot was already forming in my stomach. George cleared his throat loudly. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the dining table, and looked at me. Not like a father looking at his daughter, but like a ruthless corporate boss looking at a failing employee. "We have made a decision, Diana." My father stated, his voice completely devoid of any warmth or parental affection. "Your mother and I have been discussing the current financial climate, and we have to be practical. You are now officially unemployed. You have no income, no prospects, and no way to contribute to the household expenses. Kendra and Andre, on the other hand, are dealing with massive temporary cash flow issues." My father gestured toward my sister and brother-in-law, who were suddenly sitting up perfectly straight, looking incredibly smug. "It makes zero financial sense for Kendra to continue paying $4,500 a month for a luxury penthouse she can no longer afford." George continued smoothly. "And it makes even less sense for you to be occupying the master suite on the second floor while contributing absolutely nothing. So Kendra and Andre are going to move back into this house to save money and rebuild their financial portfolio." I looked around the room, the reality of their coordinated cruelty washing over me. "You are kicking me out," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You are kicking me out of my own home so they can live here, rent-free. It is not your home, Diana." My mother snapped viciously, her eyes flashing with anger. "It is our house, and we need your room. Kendra and Andre are trying to start a family. They are the future of this bloodline. Your bedroom is going to be completely remodeled into a nursery for our future grandchildren. What exactly are you going to use it for? Sitting around in sweatpants and applying for entry-level marketing jobs?" Kendra crossed her arms over her chest, a triumphant little smirk playing on her lips. "You should have thought about your living situation before you let yourself get fired," she muttered. George stood up, towering over the dining table, and delivered the final crushing blow. "We are not running a charity here, Diana. You are a grown woman. We gave you a roof over your head, and you became completely complacent. This is the tough love you desperately need to finally get your life together. You have exactly 60 minutes. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. 60 minutes for what? 60 minutes to pack your belongings and vacate the premises, my father said, coldly checking his gold wristwatch. "You will leave your house keys on the kitchen counter. You will take only what fits in those two suitcases. Everything else will be donated to charity tomorrow morning. If you are not out of this house by 8 o'clock tonight, I will personally call the local police and have you formally escorted off my property for trespassing." The silence that followed his threat was absolutely deafening. I looked at the four faces staring back at me. My mother, who cared more about a hypothetical grandchild than her actual flesh and blood. My father, who viewed his own daughter as a failed business transaction. My sister, who was actively stealing my sanctuary to fund her designer lifestyle. And my brother-in-law, who stood by and watched a family destroy itself over money. They were fully expecting me to break down. They wanted to see me shatter into a million pieces so they could feel powerful and justified in their incredible cruelty. But as I looked at those two battered suitcases sitting on the floor, I did not feel any sadness. I felt an overwhelming sense of liberation. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. I did not shed a single tear. I did not utter a single word of protest. I simply looked at my father, memorizing the coldness in his eyes, and gave him a single curt nod. "Your 60 minutes starts right now," George barked. I turned on my heel and walked up the carpeted stairs to my bedroom for the very last time. The space was immaculate, a quiet sanctuary I had carefully maintained while secretly building a massive corporate empire. I did not waste precious time looking at the old framed photographs or the cheap mismatched furniture my parents had forced upon me. I immediately went to my hidden wall safe and retrieved the most important items first: my heavily encrypted laptops, a thick stack of certified legal documents verifying my absolute and sole ownership of the Apex Prime entity, and my secure financial hardware wallets. I placed them carefully into my structured leather briefcase. Then I moved to the small closet. I pulled out a few neutral-colored blazers, some simple tailored trousers, and a pair of comfortable flats. I packed them efficiently into the two brown suitcases my mother had dragged out. While I was firmly zipping up the second bag, my bedroom door violently swung open. Kendra marched in, her eyes wide with a frantic, greedy energy. She was not there to say goodbye or offer comfort. She was there to loudly claim her new territory. She immediately walked into my attached bathroom and started swiping my expensive skincare products and imported toiletries off the marble counter directly into a black plastic trash bag. "What exactly are you doing, Kendra?" I asked calmly, not looking up from my suitcase. "I am helping you pack," she sneered, tying a tight, aggressive knot at the top of the garbage bag. "You do not need this luxury stuff anymore anyway. You need to start living strictly within your new unemployed means." Before I could physically stop her, she turned and marched quickly down the stairs. I followed closely behind her with my briefcase. She pushed open the heavy oak front door and aggressively hurled the loaded black plastic bag out into the freezing Connecticut rain. It landed with a pathetic, heavy splash right in the middle of the perfectly manicured front lawn, my expensive glass serum bottles shattering audibly inside the thin, wet plastic. "Get your bags and get out of my house," Kendra demanded, pointing a sharply manicured finger out into the stormy night. I walked back up to grab the handles of my two heavy brown suitcases and dragged them slowly down the stairs. George, Martha, and Andre were waiting patiently in the grand foyer. They formed a cruel little audience, standing confidently with their arms crossed, their faces completely devoid of any familial sympathy. "Do not come crying back here when your meager savings run out," my mother warned coldly, tightening her expensive silk robe tightly around her waist. "We will absolutely not be opening this front door for you." Andre chuckled darkly from the shadowy corner. "Good luck finding a cheap roadside motel that will actually take you in this terrible storm, Diana," he mocked, leaning casually against the hallway wall. "Maybe you can use that useless marketing degree to negotiate a tiny discount on a standard room with a shared bathroom." I stopped right at the front door and reached deeply into my coat pocket. I pulled out the shiny brass house key and dropped it deliberately onto the marble console table. The sharp metallic clink echoed loudly in the tense, silent foyer. "Keep the key," I said calmly, looking my father directly in the eye without a single ounce of fear. "You are going to need all the financial help you can possibly get paying the massive property taxes next month without my silent monthly contributions." George scoffed loudly, clearly missing the dangerous warning in my steady voice. I pushed the oak door open and stepped out into the freezing rain. I did not scramble defensively. I did not look back to beg for mercy or second chances. I walked gracefully down the long brick driveway toward the dark, empty street. Kendra laughed loudly from the dry shelter of the porch. "Look at her," she yelled obnoxiously over the loud crack of thunder. "She does not even have enough money to call a regular cab. She is actually going to walk in the storm like a total loser." Just as she proudly finished her cruel sentence, a pair of brilliant white headlights pierced sharply through the darkness. A sleek black Cadillac Escalade rolled smoothly and silently to a stop directly at the end of the driveway. The heavy tinted window rolled down just enough to reveal a professional driver in a crisp black suit. "Good evening, Miss Diana," the driver called out respectfully, completely ignoring the freezing rain. "Your private flight is fully prepped and waiting at the executive tarmac." I handed him my bag, stepped into the luxurious interior, and smoothly closed the heavy door. The moment the heavy door clicked shut, the sound of the freezing rain and my sister's obnoxious laughter was instantly erased. The interior of the Escalade was warm, smelling of rich leather and quiet power. I sank back into the plush seat and took a deep, steadying breath. For the first time in 10 years, I was completely free. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out my encrypted laptop, setting it carefully on my lap. Before I could open the screen, my private cell phone began to vibrate in the cup holder. It was a completely different phone from the cheap model my family always saw me carrying. This one was a highly secure line. The caller identification displayed the name Benjamin. He was my lead corporate attorney and the architect of my massive legal strategy. I answered on the first ring. "Good evening, Benjamin," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "Are all the legal filings officially complete?" Benjamin let out a low, satisfied chuckle on the other end of the line. "Everything is perfectly executed, Miss Diana," he confirmed, his voice vibrating with professional triumph. "The termination email was sent exactly as we planned. Under the strict parameters of the non-disclosure agreement, your fake persona as a mid-level marketing assistant has been legally terminated from the subsidiary shell company. You are now completely severed from that heavily restricted employment contract." I smiled, watching the dark rain-slicked streets of Connecticut fly by my tinted window. "And the hostile buyout?" I asked, needing to hear the final confirmation. "It is entirely finalized," Benjamin stated firmly. The incredibly corrupt board of directors at the parent company had absolutely no idea what was happening until it was far too late. They thought they were selling off a minor failing asset to a blind corporate trust. They never suspected that the blind trust was secretly controlled by the very same woman who founded the original agency. "The transfer of majority shares is complete. You are now the sole undisputed chief executive officer of Apex Prime." A wave of immense satisfaction washed over me. For an entire decade, I had played the ultimate long game. When I first built Apex Prime right out of college, I knew my greedy family would eventually try to claw their way into my success. So I created a massive corporate labyrinth. I hired a fake figurehead chief executive officer to stand in the public spotlight while I operated entirely in the shadows as the ghost founder. I intentionally took a low-paying assistant job within my own massive company just to keep a close, watchful eye on the daily operations. It was the perfect, impenetrable cover. My family was so blinded by their own arrogance that they never once questioned my heavily fabricated, mediocre life. The board of directors had spent the last 3 years secretly embezzling company funds to finance their own lavish lifestyles. My hostile buyout was a strategic financial move to gain absolute power and save my own life work. The non-disclosure agreement I signed years ago prevented me from revealing my true ownership to anyone. That strict document was my ultimate shield. It kept my massive wealth completely hidden during the most crucial building phases of the agency. The board thought they had me legally cornered, but I turned their restrictive corporate weapon against them. The sheer scale of my actual wealth was staggering. Apex Prime was not just a successful business. It was a dominant billion-dollar branding agency that controlled the public images of major politicians and massive global corporations. While my sister Kendra was desperately crying over a $4,500 mortgage, I was personally signing off on $90 million corporate mergers. While Andre was begging low-level sports executives for a chance to represent a single football player, I actually owned the very agency that dictated those massive athletic endorsement deals. Benjamin continued giving me the final legal rundown. "The old board members have been escorted out of the Manhattan corporate headquarters by private security," he reported smoothly. We have frozen all of their golden parachute accounts pending a full forensic audit. They finally realized they were outsmarted by the woman they thought was fetching their coffee. When do you want to release the official press statement announcing your new executive status? Hold the press release for now, I instructed calmly. I want the corporate transition to remain strictly confidential for the next few weeks. Let the industry rumors swirl. I have personal matters to attend to before I step directly into the harsh spotlight. Take your time, Diana Benjamin said. Your jet is ready. I ended the call. The Escalade smoothly merged onto the highway, leaving my toxic family behind. The Escalade pulled smoothly through the heavily guarded gates of the private aviation terminal. I did not have to deal with the exhausting lines of commercial security or the prying eyes of the public. I simply stepped out of the vehicle and walked directly onto the rain-slicked tarmac. A sleek Gulfstream G650 was waiting, its engines already humming softly in the cold night air. The flight attendant greeted me by name, taking my damp coat and offering me a warm towel. I settled into the plush leather seat and immediately opened my encrypted laptop. The screen illuminated my face, displaying a dizzying array of real-time financial dashboards and secure communication channels. My chief operating officer, a brilliant strategist named David, appeared on a secure video link almost instantly. "Good evening," Diana, David said, looking impeccably sharp despite the late hour. "The transfer of all executive powers is completely logged. Wall Street is currently asleep, but the corporate world is going to absolutely lose its mind when the markets open on Monday." I typed a quick command into my keyboard authorizing a massive transfer of operational funds. "Excellent work, David. Has the board attempted to access any of their frozen accounts yet?" David laughed, a sharp, cold sound. "Oh, they have tried. We have documented at least 12 separate attempts by the former chairman to wire funds to a Cayman Islands account. Every single attempt was automatically blocked by the new security protocols you designed. They are completely locked out of the empire they tried to steal." As David continued his detailed briefing, I let my mind drift back to the beginning of my long, arduous journey. My parents always believed I was incredibly financially ignorant. When I graduated at the absolute top of my business class with a dual degree in finance and marketing, they did not even bother to attend the ceremony. They were too busy taking Kendra to Paris to celebrate her passing the incredibly easy real estate exam on her third try. I learned very quickly that in my family, financial transparency was incredibly dangerous. My parents viewed any money I made as communal family property to be spent on their luxurious whims. So when I secretly founded Apex Prime 10 years ago, I knew I had to build a massive invisible wall around my assets. I created a highly complex network of limited liability companies and offshore financial trusts. Every single massive dividend I earned from the rapidly growing agency was immediately funneled through 3 different holding companies, before finally resting in completely secure, untraceable accounts. I lived in my childhood bedroom, driving a reliable used car, and wore simple clothes while quietly amassing a fortune that rivaled small nations. When my agency landed its first $50 million corporate account, I celebrated by eating a cheap slice of pizza alone in a diner, while my family actively mocked my low assistant salary over a lavish dinner they forced me to pay for. It was a bizarre double life, but it was absolutely necessary for my survival. David cleared his throat, pulling my attention back to the present. "We do have one minor logistical issue," he noted, pulling up a new file on his screen. The former board had previously authorized a massive luxury corporate retreat in Aspen for next month. They had already paid a non-refundable $500,000 deposit. "What do you want to do with the reservation?" I smiled, a cold, calculating expression. "Keep the reservation, David, but cancel the invitations for the old board members. I think it is time we reward the actual hardworking employees who built this agency from the ground up. Upgrade the flights to first class and open the open bar. Let them celebrate the new era of Apex Prime." David nodded approvingly, quickly typing the new directives. "Understood. And what about your immediate plans? Where exactly is this private flight taking you?" I looked out the small window as the Gulf Stream accelerated rapidly down the runway, pushing me back into the comfortable seat. I am heading to the West Coast, I replied simply. I have a piece of real estate in Malibu that requires my personal attention. It is time I finally enjoy the fruits of my decade of silent labor. Enjoy the flight, boss, David said before ending the secure connection. I closed the laptop and leaned my head against the cool glass of the window. The heavy rain clouds of Connecticut were far below me now, replaced by the endless expanse of a clear, starry night. My family thought they had successfully ruined my life by throwing me out into the storm. They had absolutely no idea that they had just unleashed a billionaire CEO who no longer had any reason to hide. The quiet, subservient daughter they had bullied for years was dead. And the woman who was about to land in California was not someone they could ever hope to control or exploit again. The warm California sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon when my private jet touched down at the Los Angeles tarmac. I bypassed the crowded commercial terminals, entirely stepping directly from the plane into a waiting luxury sedan. The drive up the Pacific Coast Highway was breathtaking. The endless blue expanse of the ocean crashing against the rugged cliffs was a stark, beautiful contrast to the cold, miserable rain I had left behind in Connecticut. For the first time in my life, I felt a deep, profound sense of peace. I was no longer playing a role. I was no longer hiding. The sedan pulled up to the towering iron gates of my Malibu estate. A state-of-the-art facial recognition system scanned me seamlessly, and the heavy gates swung open to reveal the sprawling $25 million property. The villa was a masterpiece of modern architecture, featuring expansive floor-to-ceiling glass walls that offered panoramic views of the Pacific Ocean. It was a true sanctuary, completely isolated from the toxic noise of my past. I walked through the massive double doors and into the grand foyer, dropping my leather briefcase onto the polished marble table. The house was immaculate, exactly as I had requested. The infinity pool sparkled invitingly under the morning sun. I walked straight to the custom-built wine cellar, a climate-controlled glass room that housed hundreds of rare vintages. I selected a rich, full-bodied Cabernet, poured myself a generous glass, and walked out onto the expansive wooden deck. The cool ocean breeze washed over me. I stood there looking out at the endless horizon, finally allowing myself to fully process the magnitude of what I had accomplished. I had successfully completely severed ties with the abusive family that had systematically tried to destroy my self-worth. I had secured my absolute control over a billion-dollar empire. I had won. Just as I was taking my first satisfying sip of the expensive wine, the harsh, jarring vibration of my personal cell phone shattered the serene silence. It was not my secure executive line. It was my old regular cell phone, the one my family had the number to. I considered ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. I glanced at the screen. It was a frantic, aggressive voicemail from Kendra. I pressed play and my sister's shrill, panicked voice immediately filled the quiet morning air. "Diana, where the hell are you?" she screamed into the phone, the panic evident even through the poor audio quality. "You did not even leave the house keys like Dad told you to. And listen to me very carefully. Andre just got a final warning notice from his leasing company. They are going to repossess his luxury SUV by noon today if he does not make a payment. You need to wire transfer your remaining savings to my account immediately. I know you still have at least $1,200 left in your checking account. Do not be selfish, Diana. Andre needs that car for his high-profile meetings. Send the money right now, or I swear to God I will make sure Mom and Dad never speak to you again." I listened to the entire abusive message without a single change in expression. The sheer, unadulterated entitlement was staggering. I had just been brutally thrown out of my childhood home into a freezing rainstorm with only 2 battered suitcases to my name, and her immediate reaction was to demand my last remaining dollars to fund her husband's completely unsustainable lifestyle. She did not ask if I was safe. She did not ask where I had slept. She only cared about extracting every last possible ounce of value from me before completely discarding me. They truly believed I was desperate. They truly believed I was sitting in some cheap roadside motel crying over my lost job, waiting for their inevitable forgiveness. They had absolutely no idea that I was standing on the deck of a $25 million beachfront mansion, sipping a wine that cost more than Andre's monthly car lease. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I felt absolutely nothing for them. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my wine. I looked down at the old cell phone in my hand, the device that had tethered me to their endless demands and emotional manipulation for years. With a calm, steady hand, I navigated to Kendra's contact information. I did not leave a dramatic reply. I did not try to explain myself or justify my actions. I simply tapped the block button. I watched as her name disappeared from my screen, effectively cutting off her access to me forever. I then proceeded to block George, Martha, and Andre. The digital severance was swift and absolute. I tossed the old phone onto a nearby lounge chair, turned my face back toward the warming sun, and finally truly breathed. While I was finally experiencing true peace on the sun-drenched coast of California, a completely different reality was unfolding 3,000 miles away in a gloomy real estate office in Connecticut. Kendra was sitting at her cluttered desk, frantically biting her manicured nails. The reality of her severe financial mismanagement was crashing down all at once. Her computer screen displayed a glaring red notification from the state commission. Her professional broker license was exactly 48 hours away from being officially suspended due to unpaid dues. To make matters worse, Andre had spent the entire morning screaming at a customer service representative because his luxury sports utility vehicle had indeed been repossessed right out of our parents' driveway. Without my hidden financial safety net, their fragile house of cards was collapsing into absolute ruin. Kendra desperately needed a massive commission check immediately. She had spent the last 2 hours aggressively cold, calling expired listings, getting hung up on by angry homeowners who saw right through her fake sales voice. Just as she was about to slam her phone down in total frustration, a loud ping echoed through the busy brokerage. It was the high-priority general inbox, a system set up to catch unassigned wealthy client inquiries. Kendra clicked the notification instantly, her greedy eyes scanning the brief email. It was a blind request from a massive out-of-state corporate entity known as Horizon Trust Group. The email stated they were urgently seeking an aggressive, highly discreet property manager to handle a vacant $25 million beachfront estate in Malibu. The corporate owner was permanently out of the country on business, and they needed someone to physically inspect the property, hold the keys, and prepare it for high-end leasing. The management commission fee alone was enough to pay off Kendra's entire penthouse mortgage for the next 2 years. Kendra did not stop to question why a massive corporate entity would reach out to a mid-level suburban Connecticut brokerage. Her blinding greed completely overrode basic logic. She immediately slammed her hand down on the keyboard to claim the account, but the software system flashed an error. A senior broker named Greg, a seasoned veteran who actually closed multi-million-dollar deals, had clicked it at the exact same time. Greg stood up from his desk across the room, adjusting his expensive tie. "That lead is way out of your league, Kendra," he called out firmly, walking toward the managing broker's office. A $25 million Malibu estate requires a professional who understands complex California tax codes and corporate escrow. You have not closed a single property in 8 months. You will embarrass the firm and cost us an international client. Kendra felt a massive surge of panic. If she lost this high-paying lead, she would lose her license and her luxury penthouse. She sprinted across the office, physically blocking Greg from entering the manager's door. "I am taking this lead, Greg," she hissed venomously, her eyes wide with total desperation. "I have massive connections in the California luxury market. My brother-in-law represents elite professional athletes who buy houses exactly like this one all the time. I can lease this property to an athlete by Friday." The managing broker stepped out of her private office. She looked closely at Kendra, noting the sheer manic desperation in her eyes. The firm needed the massive commission just as much as Kendra did. Fine, the manager sighed heavily, rubbing her temples. Kendra, you can have the Horizon Trust Group lead. But if you blow this deal or embarrass us in front of this corporate client, I am firing you before the state even suspends your license. Do you completely understand me? I understand perfectly, Kendra practically squealed, snatching the printed client file right out of Greg's hands. She strutted triumphantly back to her messy desk, feeling like she had just won the lottery. She quickly opened the file, her eyes widening as she looked at the glossy, high-resolution photographs of the breathtaking modern villa overlooking the beautiful Pacific Ocean. She immediately typed the exclusive property address into her phone, furiously calculating exactly how much cash she would make from the massive transaction. She had absolutely no idea that Horizon Trust Group was just one of the many subsidiary shell companies I had legally formed 5 years ago. She had no idea that the breathtaking villa in the photographs was the exact same house I was currently sitting in, sipping my expensive vintage wine. My trap was officially set, and my incredibly arrogant sister had sprinted directly into it without hesitation, fully believing she was the smartest person in the entire room. While Kendra was blindly charging headfirst into a massive trap disguised as a dream, luxury listing her husband Andre was facing his own rapidly escalating professional apocalypse. He sat in his cramped rented office space in downtown Hartford, staring blankly at the dark screen of his computer. His custom Italian suit suddenly felt tight and suffocating. The air conditioner in his office was broken, but the sweat pooling on his forehead had nothing to do with the temperature. His cell phone, resting ominously on his desk, had been ringing non-stop for the past hour. The caller identification flashed the name Marcus. Marcus was an elite first-round draft pick defensive tackle. He was not just a promising athlete, he was a generational talent destined for the National Football League, and he was Andre's only ticket out of total financial ruin. Andre finally picked up the phone, forcing a fake, confident smile onto his face, as if Marcus could actually see him through the line. "Marcus, my man," Andre said smoothly, dialing up his signature sports agent charm. "We are looking absolutely solid for the draft on Friday." "I do not want to hear about Friday right now," Andre Marcus interrupted sharply, his deep voice rumbling through the small speaker. His tone was not friendly. It was all business, cold and uncompromising. "I just got off the phone with my personal business manager. We are looking at the long-term vision here. Endorsements, national campaigns, legacy building. My manager made it perfectly clear that I need a top-tier branding strategy before I sign any rookie contract." "Absolutely," Andre agreed quickly, scrambling to pull up a generic marketing proposal on his laptop. "I have a whole team of regional public relations guys ready to roll out your image campaign the second you put on that team hat." "I do not want regional guys," Andre Marcus fired back immediately, his voice rising in irritation. "I want the absolute best in the industry. I want Apex Prime." Andre felt his stomach completely drop out from underneath him. The name Apex Prime was legendary in the corporate world. They were the undisputed titans of brand management. They represented global megacorporations and A-list celebrities. They did not take cold calls from desperate mid-level sports agents operating out of Connecticut strip malls. "Marcus, listen to me," Andre stammered frantically, loosening his expensive silk tie. "Apex Prime is notoriously exclusive. They only take on clients through highly guarded internal referrals." "I do not care how exclusive they are," Marcus snapped coldly. "That is your job as my agent. You make the connection. You get me in that room. If you cannot secure a branding partnership with Apex Prime by Thursday afternoon, I am officially firing you and signing with Creative Artists Agency. They have already reached out to my mother twice this week." Click. The line went completely dead. Andre threw his cell phone violently across the room. It smashed against the cheap drywall, leaving a dent. He was exactly 48 hours away from losing his golden goose. Panic, cold and sharp, gripped his chest. He lunged for his office phone and began aggressively dialing the main headquarters number for Apex Prime in Manhattan. He had to find a back door. He had to bribe an assistant, flatter a mid-level manager, do whatever it took to get a meeting. The call connected. A crisp, incredibly professional voice answered. Apex Prime Corporate Offices. How may I direct your call? Hi there, Andre said, pouring every ounce of desperate charm he had left into his voice. This is Andre Washington. I am representing a top-tier National Football League prospect. I need to speak directly with the head of sports partnerships or the chief executive officer immediately. I am sorry, Mr. Washington, the receptionist replied smoothly, her voice betraying absolutely no emotion. Our sports partnership division does not accept unsolicited representation requests. Furthermore, the chief executive officer does not take direct external calls. Well, what is his name? Andre demanded, his frustration quickly boiling over into anger. Let me send a direct email to the CEO. Just give me a name and an email address. The identity and contact information of our chief executive officer are strictly confidential and not available to the public, the receptionist stated, sounding like a highly programmed robot. If you wish to submit a general inquiry, you may do so through the form on our corporate website. Have a pleasant day. The line disconnected with a sharp click. Andre slammed the receiver down repeatedly. He was completely locked out. The impenetrable fortress of Apex Prime was standing solidly between him and his financial salvation. He desperately needed an inside connection. He needed someone who understood the secretive corporate world, someone who could navigate these complex administrative roadblocks. For a brief, fleeting second, he thought of Diana. She had worked in corporate marketing for a decade. She might know someone who knew someone at Apex Prime. But then he remembered he had helped throw her out into the rain just a few days ago, mocking her as a total failure. He had actively cheered as Kendra tossed her belongings onto the wet lawn. He groaned loudly, burying his face in his hands. He was entirely on his own, desperately trying to break into a massive corporate empire, without realizing that the very woman he had so cruelly discarded held the absolute key to everything he wanted. While Andre was trapped in his own professional nightmare, George and Martha were sitting at the exact same dining room table where they had banished me just days prior. The atmosphere in the Connecticut house was no longer arrogant or triumphant. It was thick with pure panic. Kendra had spent the entire morning crying hysterically on the living room sofa because her bank had officially declined her latest mortgage payment. The grace period was entirely over, and the foreclosure process on her luxury penthouse was quietly beginning. George, desperate to maintain the illusion of his perfect, wealthy family, decided to take matters into his own hands. He remembered an old joint college checking account I had opened when I was 18 years old. Because I was a teenager at the time, George had been required to co-sign as a secondary account holder. I had removed his name from the account over a decade ago when I graduated, but George arrogantly assumed he still had legal access. He pulled out an old, dusty filing cabinet and found a crumbled piece of paper with my old banking passwords. Martha stood anxiously over his shoulder, twisting her expensive pearl necklace, actively encouraging him to drain whatever funds I might have left to save their golden child. They rationalized their criminal behavior with breathtaking ease. Martha insisted that since I had lived in their house rent-free, in her delusional mind I owed them this money. George confidently typed my old username into the banking portal, fully intending to initiate a massive unauthorized wire transfer directly to Kendra. He failed to realize that while he was attempting to commit federal wire fraud on a standard laptop, my personal financial security network was operating on a level of sophistication he could not even begin to comprehend. 3,000 miles away in Malibu, I was walking along the pristine private beach behind my villa. The salty ocean breeze was incredibly refreshing. Suddenly, my secure executive smartphone chimed with a harsh, distinct alarm. It was not a standard notification. It was a high-level security breach alert from my private wealth management firm. I opened the encrypted application and immediately saw the detailed report. Someone in Connecticut, using the exact internet protocol address of my parents' house, was actively attempting to breach my legacy banking accounts using outdated credentials. I stopped walking and stared at the screen, shaking my head in absolute disbelief. They were not just cruel, they were active thieves. The system had automatically locked the old account after the first incorrect password attempt, but the sheer audacity of their action required an immediate and devastating response. I did not call them to scream or argue. Engaging in an emotional shouting match was exactly what they wanted. It would give them a chance to gaslight me and play the victim. I preferred a much more absolute form of communication. I tapped the speed dial for my corporate attorney. Benjamin answered immediately. "Good morning, Diana," he said warmly. "Is everything all right in California?" "Everything is perfect, Benjamin," I replied smoothly, watching the gentle ocean waves crash against the sand. "But I need you to execute a rapid legal strike on the East Coast. My parents are currently attempting to illegally access my private bank accounts to steal funds. I just received the biometric fraud alert." Benjamin let out a sharp sigh of professional disgust. "That is felony wire fraud and identity theft, Diana. Do you want me to contact the federal authorities and have them formally arrested?" "Not yet," I said, a cold smile forming on my lips. "I want to watch them sweat first. Draft a severe cease and desist order for financial fraud. Make the legal language as terrifying and absolute as possible. I want it hand-delivered to their front door by a professional process server within the next 2 hours. Send it via premium courier service. I will authorize the emergency legal billing." "Consider it done," Benjamin stated sharply, his fingers already typing rapidly on his keyboard. Back in Connecticut, George was furiously slamming his fist against his computer keyboard, completely locked out of the banking portal. The screen displayed a permanent security ban. Martha was pacing the dining room, complaining loudly about how selfish I was for changing my passwords. Just as George was about to suggest calling a hacker, the heavy brass doorbell rang sharply. Martha rushed to the door, expecting a package delivery. Instead, she found a tall, unsmiling man in a dark suit standing on the porch. He held a thick manila envelope. "Martha," the man asked coldly. "Yes," she answered, looking confused. "You have been served," the process server stated loudly, shoving the heavy envelope directly into her hands before turning and walking away. George rushed into the foyer. Martha tore open the envelope with trembling hands. As her eyes scanned the heavy legal document, her face drained of all color. It was not a simple warning. It was a deeply detailed legal threat citing specific federal statutes regarding wire fraud, cyber theft, and attempted grand larceny. The document explicitly stated that any further attempts to access my financial data would result in immediate criminal prosecution. George snatched the papers from her shaking hands, his eyes widening in pure terror. They had expected a weak, compliant daughter to just let them steal. Instead, they had just been slapped across the face with the full, terrifying force of the American legal system. While George and Martha were standing in their foyer, paralyzed by the terrifying reality of federal prison, my sister Kendra was sitting in a plush leather seat 30,000 feet in the air. She had absolutely no idea that her parents had just been legally destroyed by a massive cease and desist order. Her phone was in airplane mode and she was sipping complimentary champagne in first class. To secure this emergency flight to Los Angeles, she had maxed out her very last available credit card, carrying a brutal 29% interest rate she could never hope to pay off. She even rented a shiny red convertible at the airport, convincing herself that she needed to look like a highly successful broker to manage a luxury property. She drove up the winding Pacific Coast Highway with the top down, the warm California wind blowing through her hair. In her deeply delusional mind, she was a wealthy mogul on a high-stakes business trip. When her navigation system finally announced her arrival, she pulled the rented convertible up to the towering iron gates of my Malibu estate. She punched in the temporary vendor access code that my dummy corporation had provided her via email. The heavy gates swung open and Kendra audibly gasped. The sheer scale and incredible beauty of the $25 million villa completely overwhelmed her. She parked her rented car on the circular driveway and stepped out, her designer heels clicking loudly against the imported stone. The strict corporate instructions from Horizon Trust Group were incredibly clear. She was hired to perform a standard exterior perimeter check, ensure the landscaping was properly maintained, and verify the structural integrity of the security gates. She was explicitly forbidden from entering the main residence. But as Kendra walked around the stunning infinity pool and stared through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass walls, her greed completely took over. She pressed her face against the glass, admiring the custom furniture, the grand piano, and the sweeping modern staircase. She convinced herself that as the newly appointed property manager, she had an absolute right to fully inspect the interior. She walked over to the discreet utility door, where the emergency escrow lockbox was securely mounted. Using a highly unethical bypass technique she had learned during her early real estate training, she manipulated the mechanical dials. The heavy metal box popped open, revealing the shiny master key. A massive wave of adrenaline washed over her as she grasped the cold metal. She was officially crossing the line from bad judgment into criminal trespassing, but she did not care. She slid the key into the lock, turned it, and pushed the heavy wooden door open. The moment Kendra stepped inside, she was completely intoxicated by the smell of extreme wealth. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of expensive cedar and ocean salt. She wandered through my grand foyer, trailing her manicured fingers across the polished marble countertops and the expensive modern art hanging on the walls. She walked directly into the master bedroom suite, completely unaware that silent, invisible security cameras were capturing her every single move and transmitting the high-definition footage directly to my secure smartphone while I was having lunch in town. She stepped out onto the expansive private balcony overlooking the crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean. The view was absolutely breathtaking. In that moment, her fragile ego aggressively demanded public validation. She needed everyone back home to see her standing in the middle of unimaginable luxury. She pulled out her phone immediately, checking her makeup in the front-facing camera. Kendra spent the next 20 minutes posing aggressively on my balcony. She leaned against the thick glass railing, angling her body to make sure the massive infinity pool and the ocean were perfectly framed in the background. She took dozens of photos, carefully selecting the one that made her look the most affluent. She opened Instagram and began typing a highly fabricated caption. "Just closed on my absolute dream home in Malibu," she typed rapidly, adding a series of celebratory emojis. Hard work and relentless hustle finally pay off. Cannot wait to wake up to this incredible ocean view every single day. Connecticut was cute, but California is calling. Blessed. Boss life. She hit publish without a single ounce of hesitation. Almost immediately, the notifications began pouring in. Her fellow desperate real estate agents, her shallow country club friends, and random followers flooded the comments with praise and fierce envy. The dopamine hit was incredibly powerful. Kendra stood on my balcony, smiling triumphantly at her screen, completely addicted to the massive lie she had just broadcasted to the entire world. She truly believed she had finally outsmarted everyone, entirely oblivious to the terrifying reality that she had just provided me with time-stamped, highly public photographic evidence of her felony break-in. Within minutes of Kendra publishing that absurd fabrication, the image populated on Andre's phone. He was still sitting in his sweltering Hartford office, agonizing over the massive threat from his star football client. When he saw the photograph of his wife standing on the balcony of a breathtaking $25 million Malibu estate, his eyes nearly bulged out of his head. He read her caption claiming she had just closed on her dream home. He knew Kendra was completely broke. He knew she had absolutely no money to buy a coffee, let alone a beachfront mansion. But in his desperate, panicked state, he convinced himself that she had somehow pulled off the greatest real estate miracle in history. Andre did not call her to verify the truth. He saw an immediate golden opportunity to save his collapsing sports agency career. He grabbed his custom suit jacket, practically sprinting out of his small rented room and down the hall toward the senior partner's corner office. He barged in without even knocking. The two senior partners looked up, clearly annoyed by his sudden intrusion. But Andre slammed his phone down on the heavy mahogany desk, displaying the viral Instagram post for them to see. "Look at this," Andre demanded, his voice dripping with fabricated confidence. "My wife just closed a massive deal on a $25 million luxury estate in Malibu. She is officially expanding our family portfolio to the West Coast. We now have exclusive access to one of the most elite properties in California. The senior partners leaned in their eyes, scanning the glossy photograph of the infinity pool and the Pacific Ocean. They were immediately impressed by the sheer display of extreme wealth. Andre quickly capitalized on their visible awe. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. My top client, Marcus, is demanding a high-level branding meeting before the draft. Andre lied smoothly. I can fly him out to my wife's new Malibu estate. I can host the executives from Apex Prime right there on the balcony. It is the perfect high-power environment to close a multi-million-dollar athletic contract. But I need liquidity to make this happen. I need a $100,000 cash advance on my future commissions right now to secure the private flights and the catering. The partners exchanged a greedy look. The prospect of securing a first-round draft pick was too lucrative to pass up. Believing that Andre was now backed by massive real estate wealth, they agreed. Within 30 minutes, a massive wire transfer hit Andre's rapidly depleting business account. He had successfully built a massive professional lie on top of his wife's completely fabricated social media post. Meanwhile, back in Connecticut, George and Martha were still standing in their foyer, practically paralyzed by the terrifying cease and desist order I had just served them. The heavy legal document was still shaking in Martha's hands. Suddenly, her cell phone buzzed loudly with a text message from the president of her elite country club. The message read, "Martha, we just saw Kendra's incredible news on Instagram. You must be so proud of your daughter." Martha quickly opened the application and gasped loudly when she saw the photograph. The sheer terror of federal prison was instantly erased by a massive, blinding wave of arrogant pride. She shoved her phone right into George's face. "Look at this, George," she squealed excitedly. "Kendra actually did it. She closed on a mansion in Malibu. She is a California real estate mogul." George snatched the phone, his eyes greedily soaking in the image of the massive beachfront villa. He looked down at the severe legal document in his other hand and scoffed loudly. "Diana is just jealous," George declared, completely dismissing the reality of his own attempted wire fraud. "That is why she sent this ridiculous threat. She found out her younger sister is buying mansions in Malibu while she is unemployed and homeless. Throw that garbage away, Martha. We have celebrating to do." Less than an hour later, my parents walked through the heavy oak doors of their exclusive country club. They marched straight to the crowded bar, ordering expensive imported champagne on a credit card they knew was dangerously close to its limit. Martha loudly proclaimed to anyone who would listen that her brilliant daughter was now a prominent fixture in the Los Angeles luxury housing market. George basked in the envious stares of his wealthy peers. Feeling completely untouchable and utterly intoxicated by the fake prestige, George pulled out his phone right there at the bar. "We are going to California," he announced loudly to his friends. "I am booking first-class tickets for me, Martha, and Andre right now. We are going to fly out and surprise Kendra at her new mansion. We are going to spend the entire week living like royalty." He aggressively tapped his screen, purchasing 3 incredibly expensive flights. The entire family was now fully committed to a completely fabricated reality. They were spending money they did not have, making massive professional promises they could never keep, and booking flights to a property they had absolutely no legal right to enter. The dominoes were perfectly lined up, and they were the ones eagerly pushing them over. Exactly 12 hours after George eagerly pushed that final domino, a black luxury transport van pulled up to the iron gates of my Malibu estate. George, Martha, and Andre stepped out into the bright California sun, looking completely out of place with their heavy East Coast luggage. Kendra rushed down the circular driveway to greet them, throwing the heavy front doors wide open, as if she had lived there her entire life. "Welcome to my new humble abode," Kendra squealed aggressively, hugging our mother. Martha gasped dramatically as she walked into the grand foyer, her eyes greedily scanning the imported marble floors, the sweeping staircase, and the massive modern art pieces hanging on the walls. George immediately puffed out his chest, completely forgetting about the terrifying federal legal document currently sitting on his dining room table back in Connecticut. He was far too busy absorbing the sheer magnitude of the immense wealth his favorite golden child had allegedly acquired overnight. Andre was practically vibrating with nervous manic energy. He had $100,000 of his firm's money sitting in his bank account, obtained through a massive lie, and a desperate need to impress his demanding first-round football client. He walked straight through the massive living room and out onto the expansive teak pool deck overlooking the ocean. "This is absolutely perfect, Kendra," Andre declared loudly, clapping his hands together. "I am going to call my star client right now. I am going to tell him we are hosting an exclusive sunset networking mixer right here on this deck tonight." Kendra, completely drunk on her own massive lie and desperate for an audience, enthusiastically agreed. She told Andre to invite anyone he wanted, falsely claiming that her new wealthy California neighbors would absolutely love to mingle with an upcoming sports star. While Andre began frantically making phone calls to local sports executives and wealthy-looking neighbors, walking along the private beach, George decided to explore the lower level of the house. He stumbled upon my custom-built climate-controlled glass wine cellar. He did not see the discreet security cameras mounted securely in the corners. He only saw hundreds of dusty, incredibly expensive bottles. To George, anything that belonged to his children fundamentally belonged to him. He grabbed a heavy bottle of Chateau Margaux, completely oblivious to the fact that it was an incredibly rare vintage valued at over $10,000. He carried it upstairs, grabbed a heavy metal corkscrew from my pristine chef kitchen, and violently popped the cork. He poured generous glasses for everyone, laughing loudly as they toasted to their incredible new California lifestyle. They were no longer just trespassing. They were now actively committing federal grand theft. By late afternoon, my quiet, peaceful sanctuary had been completely transformed into an obnoxious, chaotic circus. Andre had successfully lured several low-level sports managers, a few desperate influencers, and some curious neighbors to the property by promising free-flowing expensive alcohol and high-profile networking opportunities. Kendra changed into a designer swimsuit she had bought on a high-interest credit card and was loudly bragging to complete strangers about how she aggressively negotiated the purchase of the estate directly from a mysterious foreign billionaire. The music was blasting from the outdoor entertainment speakers, echoing aggressively across the peaceful oceanfront. They were spilling expensive red wine on the custom white outdoor furniture, dropping food on the pristine decking, and acting like absolute royalty in a kingdom they had illegally invaded. They were so completely absorbed in their arrogant display of fake wealth that they failed to notice the subtle red lights blinking steadily on the motion sensors strategically placed around the perimeter of the property. When Kendra had initially bypassed the exterior lockbox, the system had quietly logged her unauthorized entry. But when George forcefully opened the heavily secured glass door of the wine cellar, he had unknowingly triggered a silent, high-priority federal alert. The advanced security matrix of the house was directly wired to my private executive protection team and the local Malibu Police Department. Just a few miles down the Pacific Coast Highway, I was sitting at a quiet corner table in a highly exclusive oceanfront restaurant enjoying a light seafood lunch. My secure smartphone suddenly buzzed sharply against the white tablecloth. I picked it up and tapped the screen. The high-definition live video feed from my villa immediately populated. I watched in absolute disgusted fascination as my father drank my $10,000 wine straight from the bottle. I watched my mother drop a piece of expensive cheese onto my imported Persian rug and casually kick it under the sofa. I watched my sister aggressively pose by the infinity pool, lying to my actual neighbors. And I watched Andre desperately handing out his cheap business cards to anyone who would take them. They had absolutely no idea that their massive coordinated invasion was being broadcast in crisp 4K resolution directly to the rightful owner. I did not panic. I did not rush back to my house to scream at them to leave. I calmly took another bite of my lunch. They had crossed every single legal boundary imaginable. Felony, breaking and entering, grand theft, unauthorized commercial use of a private residence. They had gleefully built their own elaborate, inescapable prison, and I was holding the only key. I picked up my phone and called Benjamin, my corporate attorney. The rats are officially in the trap, I said smoothly, watching Kendra laugh on the screen. Contact the local police chief. It is time to initiate a formal raid. Benjamin did not hesitate. He understood the exact magnitude of the situation and the precise legal requirements to ensure the arrests would hold up in federal court. I will have the entire operation coordinated by dawn. Benjamin assured me, the sharp clicking of his keyboard echoing over the secure line. We want to catch them completely off guard. I ended the call and finished my seafood lunch in absolute peace. I did not rush back to the villa. I intentionally decided to let them stay the night. I wanted them to sleep in my custom king-sized beds. I wanted them to wrap themselves in my imported Egyptian cotton sheets. I wanted them to wake up to the sound of the ocean, fully believing that they had successfully conquered the world. The higher they climbed on their mountain of pure delusion, the more devastating their inevitable fall would be. I checked into a nearby luxury hotel for the evening, occasionally glancing at the security feed on my phone. They partied until 2 in the morning, draining 3 more bottles of my vintage wine and leaving empty pizza boxes on the custom marble countertops before finally passing out in the guest suites. The next morning, the California sun rose brightly, painting the sky in vibrant shades of pink and gold. I woke up feeling completely refreshed. I took a long shower and dressed with absolute precision. I wore a perfectly tailored white power suit, a pair of expensive designer heels, and a luxury watch that cost more than my parents' entire retirement portfolio. I was not showing up as their quiet, subservient daughter. I was arriving as the billionaire chief executive officer of Apex Prime, completely ready to reclaim my stolen territory. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, my black sedan pulled up to the staging area, just a half-mile down the highway from my estate. 2 heavily armored private security vehicles were already waiting. 4 of my elite personal guards stepped out, looking incredibly intimidating in their dark tactical gear. A moment later, 3 marked Malibu police cruisers pulled up alongside us. The lead officer, a stern lieutenant named Ramirez, walked over to my car. Benjamin had already briefed him extensively and provided the police department with all the necessary digital deeds and corporate documents proving my absolute ownership of the property. "We are ready when you are, Miss Diana," Lieutenant Ramirez said, tipping his hat respectfully. "The suspects are currently gathered on the back terrace. We will breach the front entrance using your access codes and secure the perimeter immediately." I gave him a single firm nod. We drove in a tight, silent convoy down the winding coastal road. Inside the villa, my family was enjoying a completely stolen morning. Through my live security feed, I could see them sitting around the massive teak dining table on the sun-drenched terrace. Martha had somehow figured out how to use my expensive espresso machine and was pouring fresh coffee into my delicate crystal mugs. George was nursing a massive hangover, wearing one of my plush monogrammed robes he had found in the master bathroom. Andre was loudly pacing the edge of the pool, aggressively talking on his phone to a sports client, promising them a private tour of the estate later that afternoon. Kendra was sitting at the head of the table, wearing oversized designer sunglasses and furiously typing more fabricated real estate updates onto her social media accounts. I punched the master override code into my encrypted phone. The towering iron gates of the estate swung open completely silently. The police cruisers and my private security vehicles rolled smoothly onto the circular stone driveway, completely out of sight from the back terrace. The officers moved with incredible speed and military precision. I remotely unlocked the heavy oak front doors, and the police squad flooded into the grand foyer, their heavy boots thudding loudly against the imported marble floors. Out on the terrace, Andre suddenly stopped pacing. He pulled his phone away from his ear, a confused look washing over his face as he heard the heavy footsteps echoing through the house. George lowered his crystal coffee mug. Kendra stood up angrily, pulling off her sunglasses, assuming that the neighbors had come to complain about the noise. Before any of them could even take a single step toward the glass doors, Lieutenant Ramirez and 4 armed police officers burst onto the terrace. Their hands were resting firmly on their utility belts, their expressions completely devoid of any patience. Malibu Police Department Ramirez barked loudly, his authoritative voice completely shattering the peaceful ocean morning. Nobody move a single muscle. Keep your hands where we can clearly see them. George dropped his coffee mug. It shattered into a dozen pieces against the stone patio. Martha let out a high-pitched shriek of absolute terror. I stepped out from the shadows of the grand living room and walked slowly onto the sun-drenched terrace. The morning ocean breeze caught the edge of my white blazer as I stood shoulder to shoulder with the heavily armed police officers. My expression was completely blank, giving away absolutely nothing. For a brief second, the sheer shock of seeing me standing there in a tailored power suit completely paralyzed my family. They blinked rapidly, trying to process how the unemployed sister they had kicked out into the freezing Connecticut rain just days ago was suddenly standing in the middle of a California luxury estate surrounded by law enforcement. Then Kendra's absolute delusion kicked into high gear. Her brain simply could not comprehend that I was in a position of power. She instantly and aggressively reconstructed the narrative to fit her twisted reality. "What are you doing here?" Kendra shrieked, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure rage. She aggressively pointed her perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "Officer, arrest her immediately. This is my deadbeat sister. She has been stalking us. She must have tracked my location through my social media posts and followed us all the way to California to beg for money. I kicked her out of my Connecticut house because she is a complete financial burden, and now she is trespassing on my new Malibu property." My father quickly recovered from his initial shock and stepped forward, puffing out his chest to look authoritative, despite wearing my oversized monogrammed robe. "Listen to my daughter," Officer George demanded loudly, trying to use his booming corporate voice. "We are a prominent East Coast family, enjoying a private vacation at our new estate. This woman is estranged. She has serious mental issues and a history of harassing us for cash. Escort her off our property right now before we press federal stalking charges." Andre, who was still gripping his cell phone, aggressively chimed in. "I have highly sensitive sports endorsement deals happening right here on this deck today. I cannot have this broke, unstable woman ruining my professional image. Get her out of here before my wealthy clients arrive." I did not say a single word. I did not need to defend myself. I simply looked at Lieutenant Ramirez and offered a small, knowing smile. Ramirez stared at my family with an expression of pure, unadulterated, professional disgust. He did not lower his weapon. He did not order his men to stand down. "Nobody is escorting anyone anywhere until I see some hard, verified identification." Lieutenant Ramirez barked, his voice cutting through their arrogant demands like a sharp knife. "We received an automated high-level federal security breach alert from the biometric sensors inside this exact residence. A felony break-in has been officially registered. So before you start giving me orders, I need to see physical proof of residency. Show me your identification and the legal paperwork proving you have the right to occupy this $25 million estate." Kendra scoffed loudly, dramatically rolling her eyes as if the police officer was a minor inconvenience in her glamorous, highly successful life. She crossed her arms tightly over her designer swimsuit. "I am a licensed elite real estate broker," Kendra stated with overwhelming arrogance. "I do not carry around my heavy physical title deeds while I am enjoying my morning coffee by my private infinity pool. I am the property manager and the primary resident. That should be more than enough for a local cop." "It is not even remotely enough," Ramirez countered firmly, stepping closer to her. "In the state of California, occupying a residence of this immense value without verified escrow documentation or a registered lease during an active security breach investigation is probable cause for immediate arrest. Show me proof, or I am putting all four of you in handcuffs right now." Martha whimpered loudly, retreating behind George. But Kendra was completely drunk on her own fabricated reality. She genuinely believed her fake social media persona held actual legal weight. She let out a condescending laugh and quickly grabbed her cell phone from the teak dining table. "You want proof?" Kendra challenged, fiercely, aggressively tapping her screen. "Fine. I will show you proof." She opened her professional networking application and shoved the bright screen directly toward the lieutenant's face. "Look at this. This is my official broker profile. And look at my social media account." She rapidly switched to the Instagram application, displaying the viral photo she had taken on my balcony the day before. The caption proudly declared she had just closed on her dream home in Malibu. I posted this yesterday to all my wealthy clients and followers, Kendra boasted proudly, completely oblivious to the massive legal trap she was actively securing around her own ankles. Thousands of people have already congratulated me on this exact purchase. I have major industry connections out here. Lieutenant Ramirez stared at the bright phone screen, completely unblinking. He looked at the heavily filtered photograph of Kendra posing arrogantly on the balcony, and then he looked back up at her actual face. The sheer absurdity of the situation seemed to test his professional composure. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Ramirez said slowly, his tone dripping with heavy sarcasm. "You are actively attempting to present a heavily filtered social media photograph and a generic internet profile as highly secure legal documentation to a sworn law enforcement officer." Kendra huffed loudly, planting her hands firmly on her hips. "It proves I have public claim to the estate," she argued fiercely, her voice rising in pitch. "My husband is a top-tier sports agent. My parents are prominent country club members. We belong here. That woman standing next to you is a complete fraud. She does not have a single dime to her name. Arrest her and get off my property before I call your commanding officer and have you stripped of your rank." I stood silently watching my sister actively dig her own grave deeper than I ever could have imagined. She was so heavily invested in the massive lie she had told her colleagues, her husband, and the world, that she actually expected the local police to simply bow down to her fabricated internet clout. I did not laugh at my sister's profound stupidity, even though the sheer absurdity of her defense was almost comical. Instead, I stepped forward, closing the short physical distance between myself and the police lieutenant. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy leather-bound folder. I held it out toward Lieutenant Ramirez. "You asked for physical proof of residency and legal ownership, officer," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent terrace. "I believe you will find everything you need right in here." Ramirez took the heavy folder from my hands, his eyes briefly flicking toward Kendra, who was now glaring at me with pure venom. "What kind of fake garbage did you print off the internet?" Kendra spat, taking an aggressive step forward before a police officer firmly blocked her path. "She does not own anything here, officer. She was just fired from her pathetic entry-level job 3 days ago." Lieutenant Ramirez completely ignored her shrieking. He flipped open the leather cover and began meticulously examining the crisp, notarized pages inside. The first document was the incredibly detailed limited liability company formation paperwork establishing Horizon Trust Group as a legally registered corporate entity in the state of California. The second document was the corporate charter explicitly naming me as the sole managing member and absolute beneficiary of the trust. And the final document resting at the very bottom of the stack was the original state-certified grant deed. It contained the exact parcel number, the property boundaries of the $25 million estate, and my legal signature stamped directly beneath the heavy gold seal of the county clerk. The terrace was incredibly quiet, the only sound coming from the gentle ocean waves crashing against the beach below. Ramirez took his time reading every single line with professional scrutiny. Finally, he closed the heavy leather folder and handed it back to me with a respectful nod. "Everything is in perfect order," Miss Diana Ramirez stated clearly, making sure his voice carried over to where my family was standing. "You are the verified legal owner of this property." The absolute color drained instantly from my father's face. George staggered backward, his knees practically buckling under the weight of the realization. Martha let out a quiet, pathetic gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. Andre looked like he had just been physically punched in the stomach. But Kendra refused to let her massive delusion die. "That is completely impossible," Kendra screamed, her voice cracking with pure panic. "She is lying. Those documents are totally forged. Look at her. She is wearing a cheap suit that she bought at a discount mall. She does not have $25 million. I am the property manager for Horizon Trust Group." "You are absolutely nothing, Kendra." I finally spoke, looking her directly in the eye. "Horizon Trust Group is my personal holding company. I created the blind email request you fought so desperately to claim at your failing real estate brokerage. You did not get hired by a foreign billionaire. You were lured here by the sister you threw out into the rain. I wanted to see exactly how far your greed would push you, and you did not disappoint me. You bypassed a secure federal lockbox, trespassed on private property, and invited total strangers into my home. Lieutenant Ramirez turned his full, terrifying attention back to Kendra. His hand moved swiftly to the cold metal handcuffs resting on his heavy utility belt. Kendra, you have officially admitted to accessing this property without the explicit consent of the verified legal owner, Ramirez said, his voice cold and strictly professional. Furthermore, we have direct video evidence provided by the homeowner showing you and your family illegally consuming a bottle of vintage wine valued at over $10,000. That constitutes a massive felony in this jurisdiction. The lieutenant continued, pulling the handcuffs free with a sharp metallic clink. You are formally under arrest for felony breaking and entering, criminal trespassing, and grand theft. Turn around and place your hands behind your back immediately. Kendra froze, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. The glamorous California fantasy she had aggressively built on social media was collapsing around her. She looked frantically at our parents, expecting George to step in and aggressively use his wealth to bully the police officer like he always did back in Connecticut. But George was completely silent, staring blankly at the shattered coffee mug on the patio floor, suddenly realizing that the daughter he had always treated like a burden held the absolute power to send them all to federal prison. He had no authority here. His arrogant East Coast attitude meant absolutely nothing against a fully verified California grant deed. George finally found his voice, though it completely lacked its usual booming authority. He took a hesitant step toward Lieutenant Ramirez, forcing a weak, incredibly unnatural smile onto his pale face. "Officer, there has clearly been a massive misunderstanding here," George stammered, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "This is just a silly sibling rivalry. We are a family. Diana is my oldest daughter and Kendra is her younger sister. You absolutely do not need to involve the criminal justice system in a simple domestic disagreement over a vacation house. We will just pack our things and leave right now. No harm done." Martha quickly joined in, tears freely streaming down her heavily made-up face. She clasped her hands tightly together, pleading directly with me instead of the police. "Diana, please tell them to stop," my mother begged, her voice trembling with genuine panic. "You cannot let them arrest your own flesh and blood. Think about the family reputation back in Connecticut. Think about what our friends at the country club will say if they find out about this. We are your family. You have to protect us." I looked at my mother, feeling absolutely no sympathy for her sudden desperation. When she was packing my bags and throwing me out of my childhood home, she did not care about my reputation. When Kendra was tossing my belongings onto the wet lawn, they did not care about protecting me. They only remembered we were family when they needed a human shield to block the consequences of their own incredibly greedy actions. "I do not have a family," I stated clearly, my voice cold and entirely devoid of emotion. I turned my attention away from my parents and looked directly at Lieutenant Ramirez. "Officer, these individuals are estranged. I have absolutely no ongoing personal or financial relationship with them. They do not have my permission to be on my property. They bypassed my security system, and I want to press full federal charges to the absolute maximum extent of the law." Ramirez gave a short affirmative nod. "You heard the homeowner," he said, gesturing to his heavily armed squad. "Secure the suspects." The officers moved in immediately. Kendra let out a piercing, hysterical scream as a female officer grabbed her arms and aggressively twisted them behind her back. "You cannot do this to me!" Kendra sobbed wildly, her designer sunglasses falling off her head and clattering onto the stone patio. "I am a luxury real estate broker. You are ruining my entire career." The cold metal handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists with a sharp, unforgiving snap. Andre tried to pull away from the officers, his eyes darting frantically toward the glass doors, as if he were calculating a foolish escape. "Do you know who I am?" Andre yelled desperately, his custom suit wrinkling as two large officers pinned him firmly against the teak dining table. I represent first-round draft picks. I have a massive networking event scheduled here in 2 hours. You are destroying multi-million-dollar athletic contracts. The officers completely ignored his frantic bragging, snapping a second pair of heavy handcuffs securely around his wrists. George and Martha were ordered to stand back against the glass walls, completely helpless to stop the arrests. Ramirez instructed two officers to escort Kendra and Andre out through the main house. I followed closely behind them, watching as my sister and brother-in-law were forcefully marched through my grand foyer. When the heavy front doors swung open, the bright California sun illuminated a scene of absolute social devastation. The loud music and commotion from earlier had drawn significant attention. Several of my incredibly wealthy neighbors, the exact same people Kendra had planned to aggressively network with, were standing near the edge of their driveways, walking their dogs, or watching from their expensive luxury vehicles. A few local sports executives that Andre had hastily invited were just arriving, stepping out of their cars, only to witness the spectacular downfall. Kendra and Andre were paraded directly down the long circular stone driveway. Kendra desperately tried to hide her face behind her blonde hair, weeping loudly as the neighbors stared in open shock and disgust. Andre kept his head completely down, his posture completely broken, deeply humiliated in front of the very industry professionals he had lied to just hours before. The officers guided them toward the marked police cruisers waiting by the iron gates. The sheer humiliation of the moment was absolute. The shiny social facade they had spent years meticulously crafting, the fake wealth they constantly flaunted, and the arrogant superiority they constantly projected were entirely shattered. They were pushed roughly into the back of the police cruisers, the heavy doors slamming shut behind them. I stood on my front porch watching the flashing red and blue lights reflect off the pristine California landscaping, feeling nothing but profound satisfaction. The rest of the day was an absolute nightmare for my parents, which meant it was incredibly peaceful for me. George and Martha were left standing on my circular stone driveway with their heavy East Coast luggage looking completely lost. I did not offer them a glass of water. I simply had my private security team escort them off the property boundaries. They were forced to drag their expensive suitcases down the side of the busy Pacific Coast Highway until they could finally flag down a cheap local taxi to take them to a budget roadside motel. Meanwhile, Kendra and Andre were sitting in cold concrete, holding cells at the Malibu Police Precinct, being formally booked for multiple serious felonies. Because neither of them had permanent residences in California, and both posed a massive flight risk, the judge set their bail incredibly high. George spent the entire afternoon frantically calling his retirement fund manager, practically begging for an emergency liquidation, just to secure the massive bond required to get his golden child out of jail. It took 24 agonizing hours for the required funds to finally clear the complex banking system. During that extended wait, the heavy wheels of corporate justice were turning much faster than the criminal ones. My attorney Benjamin did not waste a single second. He immediately forwarded the official police report, the crystal-clear video evidence of the break-in, and the undeniable proof of the escrow lockbox tampering directly to the state real estate commissions in both California and Connecticut. He also sent a courtesy copy directly to the managing broker at Kendra's specific agency. When Kendra finally walked out of the local police station late Wednesday afternoon, wearing the exact same wrinkled designer swimsuit underneath an oversized, scratchy jail-issue sweatshirt, she looked absolutely pathetic. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was a tangled mess, and her expensive spray tan was streaked with dried tears of pure self-pity. George and Martha were waiting anxiously by the curb in a cheap compact rental car that smelled like stale cigarette smoke. Kendra practically sprinted toward them, snatching her clear plastic personal belongings bag from the releasing officer without saying thank you. She did not hug her parents. The very first thing she did was desperately dig her expensive smartphone out of the plastic bag. She aggressively held down the power button, fully expecting to see hundreds of sympathetic messages from her loyal social media followers or frantic concerned calls from her managing broker checking on her well-being. She still genuinely believed she could spin this massive arrest into a story of corporate misunderstanding. But as the screen illuminated, the device froze for a solid minute. An absolute avalanche of automated legal alerts, angry text messages, and highly urgent corporate emails flooded her notification center all at once. Kendra opened the most urgent email, which was marked with a bright red priority flag. It was a formal, digitally certified notice directly from the California Department of Real Estate. The bold subject line read, "Immediate Emergency License Revocation." Benjamin had ensured the governing board saw exactly how she weaponized her out-of-state professional credentials to manipulate a highly secure escrow box and illegally access a $25 million private estate. The detailed email explicitly stated that due to her active pending felony charges involving severe real estate fraud, criminal trespassing, and grand theft, her reciprocity privileges were permanently terminated, effective immediately. The board completely stripped her of any legal authority to view, show, or negotiate property anywhere within the vast state borders of California, under any circumstances whatsoever. She was officially and permanently blacklisted from ever conducting any type of business on the West Coast. Before she could even process that massive professional loss, she opened the second email. This one was the absolute death blow sent directly from her own managing broker back in Connecticut. It was a brutal, uncompromising termination letter. Her local agency had been notified of her highly public arrest and the incredibly viral, embarrassing nature of her ridiculous lies. The managing broker explicitly cited a complete and total violation of their strict ethical conduct clause. The letter casually mentioned that her corporate email account was permanently disabled and her desk was being cleared out by the janitorial staff. Adding ultimate insult to massive injury, all of her active client listings had already been officially reassigned to Greg, the senior broker she had aggressively fought with just a few days prior. Kendra stood completely frozen on the dirty, cracked sidewalk outside the police precinct. Her phone slipped from her trembling hands, shattering the glass screen against the concrete. She had absolutely no professional license, no corporate job, and absolutely no future in the industry she loved. She was professionally dead. I stood a few yards away in the bright California sun, watching my sister stare blankly at her shattered phone on the dirty pavement. My corporate attorney, Benjamin, stood to my right holding a sleek leather briefcase. We had driven to the precinct not to gloat, but to finalize the absolute destruction of their control over me. As I walked slowly toward them, the sharp clicking of my heels echoed loudly against the concrete stairs. George looked up, his eyes bloodshot and heavily lined with profound exhaustion. The arrogant patriarch of the Connecticut suburbs was completely gone. In his place stood a broken, desperate old man who finally realized the massive consequences of his own greed. "Diana, please," George begged, taking a hesitant step forward before Benjamin smoothly positioned himself between us. He held up his hands in total surrender. "You have made your point. You have completely destroyed her career. Andre is going to lose his sports agency. They have absolutely nothing left. If these felony charges proceed to trial, they are both going to federal prison. You cannot send your own sister to a concrete cell. I am begging you to drop the charges." I looked at my father, feeling absolutely no pity for the tears streaming down his face. "You did not care about my well-being when you threw me out into a freezing storm," I replied calmly. "You only care about prison because it reflects poorly on your precious country club reputation. You do not regret what you did to me. You only regret that you finally picked the wrong victim." Martha began to sob loudly, clutching George's wrinkled shirt. "Please, Diana," Martha cried out. "We will do absolutely anything. We will go back to Connecticut and never bother you again. Just please call off the police." I turned slightly, giving Benjamin a simple nod. He popped the brass latches on his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of crisp legal documents. He handed a heavy black pen to my father. "The felony charges are pending with the district attorney," Benjamin stated in a crisp tone. "However, As the primary witness, my client has the unique leverage to officially decline cooperation. If she signs an affidavit of non-prosecution, the state will be forced to drop the criminal case. But she will only do this under one non-negotiable condition. George stared at the thick stack of papers. "What is it?" he asked softly. "It is a complete and irrevocable severance of all familial ties," I explained, looking directly into my father's terrified eyes. "This document is a legally binding non-disclosure and non-contact agreement. By signing it, you are permanently relinquishing any future claims to my estate, my corporate assets, and my personal wealth. It officially states that we are no longer family in the eyes of the law. If any of you ever attempt to contact me, approach my properties, or publicly discuss my business, this contract automatically triggers a $5 million penalty and reinstates the criminal complaints." "You want us to legally disown you?" Martha gasped in absolute shock. "You already disowned me the night you packed my bags," I corrected her sharply. "I am simply forcing you to put it in writing. You have a very simple choice. Sign this document and walk away with your freedom, or refuse, and I will personally testify against Kendra and Andre in federal court next month." Kendra let out a pathetic wail. She fell to her knees on the dirty concrete. "Sign it, Dad," she sobbed hysterically. "Just sign it. I cannot go to prison." Andre did not even hesitate for a single passing second. He snatched the heavy pen and hastily scribbled his signature on the bottom line, completely eager to save his own skin, regardless of the massive familial cost. He shoved the clipboard toward his wife. Kendra signed it with trembling hands, her tears staining the crisp paper. George looked at me one last time, searching for a tiny shred of the obedient daughter he used to aggressively command. He found absolutely nothing but a cold, impenetrable wall. His shoulders slumped forward. He took the pen and signed his name, effectively signing away his oldest daughter forever. Martha wept bitterly as she added her signature to the final page. Benjamin carefully took the documents back, verifying every single signature before sliding them securely into his briefcase. The transaction was complete. I had officially bought my permanent freedom. I did not offer them a single word of goodbye. I did not wish them luck on their miserable flight back to the East Coast. I simply turned my back on them, walked down the concrete steps of the local police precinct, and stepped into my waiting black luxury sedan. 3 months passed since the absolute devastation of my family in Malibu. The crisp autumn air had finally settled over Los Angeles, bringing with it the highly anticipated social event of the season. It was the Apex Prime Annual Charity Gala, an incredibly exclusive gathering of the most powerful corporate executives, Hollywood elites, and influential philanthropists in the country. The event was being held at a breathtaking historic estate in Beverly Hills, meticulously transformed by my event design team into a sprawling, elegant wonderland of cascading white florals and crystal lighting. I was no longer the invisible ghost founder operating in the shadows. The incredibly messy corporate transition was officially complete, and Wall Street had fully embraced my aggressive, highly profitable new vision for the agency. I was finally ready to make my highly publicized official debut as the absolute sole chief executive officer of Apex Prime. I stood in the luxurious bridal suite of the estate, making the final adjustments to my custom floor-length emerald green gown. The intricate beadwork caught the light perfectly, and my diamond necklace felt heavy and substantial against my collarbone. I looked in the antique mirror and saw a woman who had completely rebuilt herself from the absolute ashes of familial abuse. While I was preparing to step into the blinding flashbulbs of the waiting paparazzi, a completely different scene was unfolding near the service entrance at the back of the massive estate. Andre was standing in the shadows by the industrial dumpsters, shivering slightly in the cool evening air. He looked absolutely terrible. The sleek, arrogant sports agent who had confidently ordered my eviction 3 months ago was entirely gone. His custom Italian suits had all been aggressively repossessed or pawned to pay for Kendra's massive legal defense fees. He was wearing an ill-fitting, cheap black tuxedo he had clearly rented, and his eyes were sunken and bloodshot from weeks of severe sleep deprivation and mounting financial terror. Following Kendra's highly public, incredibly humiliating arrest and the permanent revocation of her real estate license, Andre's life had rapidly spiraled into absolute chaos. His senior partners at the Hartford Sports Agency had fired him the very next morning, demanding the immediate repayment of the $100,000 cash advance he had fraudulently obtained using Kendra's fake Malibu mansion photos. When he could not produce the money, they sued him into absolute oblivion. His star football client Marcus had publicly dropped him and signed with a rival agency within 48 hours. Andre was currently facing personal bankruptcy, intense corporate litigation, and the terrifying reality of his wife's looming federal criminal trial. In a desperate, incredibly pathetic final attempt to save himself, Andre had leveraged a minor favor from an old high school friend who worked for the high-end catering company servicing my gala. He had completely fabricated a story about needing to surprise a wealthy potential client inside. The catering manager, completely unaware of Andre's massive toxic baggage, had foolishly agreed to let him slip through the busy kitchen doors just as the main dinner service was beginning. Andre navigated the chaotic, incredibly hot kitchen, expertly dodging waiters carrying massive trays of seared scallops and expensive champagne. He pushed through the heavy swinging doors and immediately stepped into the breathtaking grand ballroom. He was completely overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the extreme wealth surrounding him. Billionaires were casually chatting near the ice sculptures. A-list actors were laughing at the VIP tables. This was the exact high society world he had desperately tried to fake his entire life, and he was currently standing in it as a complete, utter failure. He grabbed a half-empty glass of champagne off a passing waiter's tray and quickly retreated into the shadows near the massive marble pillars. His entire incredibly flawed plan hinged on one desperate, nearly impossible goal. He needed to physically corner the elusive, mysterious chief executive officer of Apex Prime tonight. He had absolutely no idea who the CEO actually was, as my identity had been heavily protected by strict non-disclosure agreements leading up to this exact evening. But Andre was entirely convinced that if he could just get 5 minutes of FaceTime with the absolute head of the empire, he could aggressively pitch his sports connections and beg for a low-level consulting job. He needed the massive corporate protection and the steady paycheck to stop his total financial bleeding. He scanned the crowded, glittering room, desperately trying to identify the most powerful person in the heavily guarded VIP section. He noticed a massive surge of activity near the main stage. The heavy velvet curtains were shifting, and the elite security personnel were suddenly moving into tight, highly strategic formations. The wealthy crowd began to quiet down, sensing that the main event was about to begin. Andre gripped his cheap champagne glass tightly, his heart pounding aggressively in his chest. He slowly edged his way closer to the front, completely unaware that he was about to walk directly into the absolute worst nightmare of his entire, miserable life. Andre pressed his back firmly against the cool marble pillar, clutching his cheap champagne glass so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. The massive crystal chandeliers, suspended high above the grand ballroom, suddenly dimmed, plunging the glittering crowd into an expectant, hushed silence. A single, brilliant spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the grand stage at the far end of the room. The soft murmur of the elite guests faded away entirely. A highly polished announcer stepped up to the crystal podium, adjusting the microphone with practiced ease. "Good evening, distinguished guests!" The announcer's voice boomed rich and resonant through the state-of-the-art sound system. Tonight we celebrate a monumental new era for Apex Prime. For a decade, the incredible visionary behind this massive global empire chose to operate entirely in the shadows, quietly building the most dominant brand management agency in the world. But tonight, that silence ends. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the sole founder, absolute owner, and chief executive officer of Apex Prime. Andre leaned forward eagerly, his eyes straining through the dim light. He desperately needed to memorize the face of the billionaire he was about to practically beg for his professional life. He expected an older, intimidating corporate titan, a ruthless Wall Street veteran. He was already rehearsing his pathetic, desperate elevator pitch in his head, calculating exactly how low he would have to bow to secure just 5 minutes of their time. The heavy velvet curtains parted slowly. The spotlight tracked the figure stepping confidently onto the stage. The crowd erupted into thunderous, respectful applause. The billionaire walked gracefully toward the crystal podium, the intricate beadwork of her emerald green gown shimmering violently under the intense light. Andre stopped breathing. His cheap champagne glass slipped through his numb fingers, shattering loudly against the polished marble floor. The sharp sound was completely drowned out by the massive applause, but the physical impact mirrored the absolute destruction happening inside his brain. It was Diana. The woman standing center stage, commanding the absolute respect and admiration of billionaires, Hollywood elites, and industry titans, was the exact same woman he had aggressively mocked just 3 months ago. It was the sister-in-law he had called a pathetic 34-year-old dead weight. It was the woman he had actively helped throw out into a freezing Connecticut rainstorm because she allegedly could not afford to pay his wife's luxury mortgage. The woman who wore plain clothes, drove a reliable used car, and quietly paid his expensive dry cleaning bills while he arrogantly paraded around in custom Italian suits he could not actually afford. She stood at the microphone looking absolutely radiant, powerful, and utterly untouchable. The heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone caught the spotlight, sending brilliant flashes of light across the room. She smiled, a calm, commanding expression that Andre had never seen on her face before. It was not the quiet, subservient smile she used to offer at tense family dinners. It was the smile of a predator who had successfully conquered her entire industry. "Thank you," I said, my voice projecting clearly and confidently across the massive ballroom. My family always believed I was just a mid-level marketing assistant. They always assumed my quiet nature was a sign of professional weakness. They did not understand that while they were busy demanding an audience, I was busy quietly buying the entire theater. Andre felt his knees actually buckle. He violently grabbed the edge of the marble pillar to stop himself from collapsing completely to the floor. The sheer magnitude of his colossal historic mistake crashed down upon him with the force of a physical blow. He had not just burned a bridge, he had actively, maliciously detonated a nuclear bomb on the only bridge that could have ever saved him from total financial ruin. Every single desperate, panicked phone call he had made to Apex Prime over the last 3 months, begging the corporate receptionist for a meeting. Every single lie he had told his former senior partners about his elite connections. The $100,000 cash advance he had fraudulently stolen. The impending personal bankruptcy. The aggressive lawsuits. It all led back to this exact horrifying moment. He had spent years systematically disrespecting the one person who held the absolute power to make him a multimillionaire with a single signature. He had thrown away the ultimate golden ticket because his incredibly fragile ego demanded that he feel superior to a woman who was infinitely smarter, wealthier, and more powerful than he could ever possibly hope to be. He watched me deliver my corporate speech, captivated by the absolute authority in my voice. The billionaires in the front row were nodding deeply in agreement with my strategic vision. A-list actors were smiling at my jokes. And Andre, the arrogant sports agent who thought he controlled the world, was hiding by the kitchen doors in a cheap rented tuxedo, completely broken by the terrifying realization that the woman he had mercilessly bullied was the undisputed queen of the empire he desperately wanted to serve. I finished my keynote address to a massive standing ovation. I smiled graciously, thanking the wealthy audience before stepping off the brightly lit stage and into the quiet, heavily guarded backstage corridor. My chief operating officer, David, handed me a glass of imported sparkling water, congratulating me on the flawless delivery. I took a slow sip, feeling the incredible adrenaline rush of complete victory. But before David and I could walk down the hall to the private executive lounge, a frantic figure burst through the service doors at the far end of the corridor, aggressively shoving past a startled catering waiter. It was Andre. Up close, he looked even more pathetic than he had on the high-definition security cameras in Malibu. His cheap rented tuxedo was deeply wrinkled and stained with sweat. He looked like a desperate cornered animal. My private security detail instantly stepped forward, reaching inside their dark jackets to remove the threat, but I raised my hand slightly. I wanted to hear exactly what he had to say. "Stop," I instructed my guards, my voice echoing in the quiet hallway. "Let him speak." Andre stumbled forward and literally collapsed onto his knees against the plush red carpet. He did not care that David and several high-level corporate executives were watching him with absolute disgust. "Diana, please." Andre gasped, heavy tears freely streaming down his face. "You have to listen to me. I had absolutely no idea. If I had known you were the billionaire chief executive officer of Apex Prime, I would have never treated you that way." He reached out and grabbed the hem of my emerald green gown, his hands shaking violently. "It was all Kendra." He sobbed wildly, completely, throwing his wife to the wolves without a single second of hesitation to save his own skin. "She completely manipulated me. She told me you were a lazy burden. She forced me to kick you out of the house that night. I never wanted to do it, Diana. I always respected your hard work. You have to believe me. I was completely blinded by her toxic lies. I know I laughed when you walked out into the storm, but I was just trying to appease my incredibly selfish wife." He looked up at me, his eyes wide with sheer panic. "My former firm is aggressively suing me for the cash advance. I am facing total personal bankruptcy. My star football client publicly fired me and signed with another agency. Please, Diana, you have the absolute power to fix this entire mess. Just give me a low-level consulting contract. Give me the National Football League partnership deal. I will do anything you want. I will scrub the floors of your corporate headquarters. Just do not let me lose everything." I looked down at the pathetic man who had laughed loudly while I stood in the freezing Connecticut rain with two battered suitcases. He was weeping uncontrollably, completely abandoning his marriage, his familial loyalty, and his basic human dignity for a corporate paycheck. I gently but firmly pulled the expensive fabric of my gown out of his desperate grip. "You are right about one thing, Andre," I said smoothly, my voice cold and entirely devoid of any sympathy. "I do have the absolute power to fix your career. And Apex Prime is indeed launching a massive new sports partnership division next week. We are actively taking over the global endorsement deals for the top draft picks." A massive wave of pure relief washed over Andre's tear-stained face. "Oh, thank God," he breathed heavily, a pathetic smile forming on his lips. "Thank you, Diana. I promise I will make you millions. I will be your absolute best agent." I did not offer him a job. Instead, I turned toward the heavy oak doors of the VIP Executive Lounge. "Let me introduce you to the man who will actually be running that entire lucrative division," I said calmly. The oak doors swung open and a tall, impeccably dressed African-American man stepped into the hallway. Andre's eyes widened in absolute paralyzing horror. The man walking toward us was not a stranger. It was Donovan. Donovan was the most ruthless, highly successful sports agent on the East Coast. He represented the absolute highest-paid athletes in the world, and he was Andre's absolute bitterest industry rival. They had spent the last 5 years aggressively fighting over the exact same athletic clients, with Andre constantly and publicly losing every single major negotiation. To see Donovan standing there elevated to the highest executive position within the billion-dollar Apex Prime empire was the ultimate psychological torture for Andre. "Good evening, Diana," Donovan said warmly, ignoring Andre completely as if he were just a stain on the carpet. The keynote speech was absolutely magnificent. "Thank you, Donovan," I replied, gesturing gracefully toward the weeping man on the floor. "I believe you know Andre. He was just asking about an entry-level consulting position in your new department." Donovan finally looked down at Andre, his expression twisting into a mask of pure professional pity. "I am sorry," Andre Donovan stated coldly, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "But Apex Prime only hires elite agents who can actually close a contract without fraudulently lying to their senior partners. We have absolutely no use for a disgraced bankrupt fraud in this agency." The absolute finality of Donovan's words completely shattered whatever tiny shred of hope Andre had left. He let out a loud, agonizing wail of pure despair, burying his face in his hands. He was a completely destroyed man. I looked at my lead security guard and gave a single dismissive nod. "Get this trash out of my building," I ordered coldly. Two massive security guards immediately stepped forward. They grabbed Andre by the arms of his cheap rented tuxedo and hauled him roughly to his feet. He did not even try to fight back. He went completely limp, sobbing uncontrollably, as they dragged him down the long hallway and shoved him aggressively out the back service doors into the cold, dark alley. While Andre was lying in the dirty alley behind the Beverly Hills estate, completely stripped of his dignity and professional future, a much quieter but equally devastating tragedy was unfolding on the East Coast. It was a bleak, overcast Friday morning in Connecticut. The vibrant autumn leaves had all fallen, leaving the neighborhood looking barren and gray. Inside the sprawling colonial house where I had spent my entire miserable childhood, George and Martha were sitting at the exact same heavy oak dining table where they had proudly banished me just months earlier. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating. Without my silent monthly financial transfers covering the exorbitant property taxes and utility bills, the house had quickly become an unmanageable financial black hole. George was staring blankly at a massive stack of past due notices, his reading glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose. Martha was nervously clutching a cold cup of coffee wrapped in a thick cardigan because they had been forced to turn the heating system down to save money. Their country club membership had been quietly suspended. Their wealthy friends had completely stopped calling after Kendra's incredibly public, humiliating arrest in Malibu. They were entirely isolated, trapped in a massive luxury house they could no longer afford to keep warm. The tense silence of the morning was suddenly shattered by a series of sharp, aggressive knocks at the heavy front door. It was not the polite tap of a neighbor or a delivery driver. It was the loud, authoritative pounding of law enforcement. George jumped slightly. Dropping a past due electric bill onto the table, he slowly stood up, his joints aching, and walked down the long hallway toward the grand foyer. Martha followed closely behind him, a deep sense of dread pooling in her stomach. George pulled the heavy oak door open fully, expecting to see a local delivery man. Instead, he found two uniformed county sheriffs standing on his pristine front porch, flanked by a stern woman in a sharp gray business suit, holding a thick clipboard. "George?" the woman asked coldly, not offering a polite greeting or a handshake. "Yes, I am George," my father replied, his voice wavering slightly. "How can I help you?" "I am a legal representative for the regional bank," the woman stated, stepping forward and handing him a thick, heavily stamped document. "I am here to officially serve you with a final notice of foreclosure and immediate property seizure. The 90-day grace period has fully expired. The bank now holds the absolute legal deed to this property." George stared at the document, his mind completely refusing to process the terrifying words printed on the page. Martha gasped loudly, grabbing George's arm. "This has to be a massive mistake," George stammered, his face turning an unhealthy shade of pale white. "We own this house. We have lived here for over 30 years. My primary mortgage was completely paid off 5 years ago. I do not owe your bank a single dime." The representative did not look sympathetic. She flipped to the second page on her clipboard and tapped it with her pen. "Your primary mortgage was indeed paid off," she confirmed coldly. "However, 7 months ago, a massive secondary mortgage was taken out against the total equity of this estate. A home equity line of credit in the amount of $400,000 was fully withdrawn and transferred into a corporate business account registered to your son-in-law, Andre." Martha let out a piercing shriek of absolute horror. "Andre," she cried out, her knees practically buckling. George felt the entire world violently spin around him. The horrifying realization hit him like a freight train. 7 months ago, Andre had come to him with a massive stack of complex legal documents, claiming they were just standard character reference forms for his sports agency license renewal. George, who blindly trusted his flashy, arrogant son-in-law, had signed every single page without reading a single word. He had unknowingly authorized Andre to completely drain the massive equity of their family home to fund his failing business ventures. Andre has not made a single payment on this high-interest loan in 4 months. The bank representative continued, her voice completely devoid of any emotion. The bank has been sending certified warning letters to this address for the past 90 days. George looked toward the front hallway table, suddenly remembering how Andre used to always eagerly fetch the mail for them whenever he visited. Andre had been deliberately intercepting and destroying the foreclosure warnings to hide his massive financial crimes. "This is fraud!" George screamed, his voice cracking with pure panic. "I did not authorize this. My son-in-law lied to me. You have to arrest him. You cannot take my home. Any claims of internal family fraud are a civil matter for you to discuss with your personal attorney," the representative replied firmly, stepping back to let the sheriffs move forward. "But it does not change the absolute legal standing of the bank. The loan defaulted. The foreclosure is final. You and your wife have exactly 48 hours to completely vacate the premises before the county sheriffs return to physically remove you and change the locks." The sheriffs turned and walked back down the brick driveway, completely ignoring the desperate, agonizing pleas of my parents. George collapsed against the heavy doorframe, clutching the eviction notice to his chest. He looked out at the manicured lawn, the shiny, leased cars that were about to be repossessed, and the perfect suburban neighborhood he had proudly lorded over for decades. He had literally nothing left. The golden child was a convicted felon, the successful son-in-law was a bankrupt fraud, and the daughter who had actually funded his entire wealthy existence was completely legally gone forever. The initial shock of the eviction notice quickly morphed into a frantic, clawing desperation. George refused to pack his bags. He spent the next 12 hours furiously pacing the hardwood floors of the freezing colonial house, surrounded by decades of accumulated luxury he was about to lose. He aggressively scoured every single page of the heavily stamped bank documents, looking for a legal loophole or a clerical error. He found a tiny sliver of hope buried deep in the fine print on the very last page. The regional bank had not actually initiated the final foreclosure process themselves. They had immediately sold the defaulted high-risk secondary mortgage to a private corporate equity firm based in Manhattan known as Vanguard Holdings, LLC. George convinced himself that he could talk his way out of this. He firmly believed that private equity firms were run by reasonable businessmen who would rather negotiate a restructured payment plan than deal with the massive legal hassle of a messy residential eviction. Using his absolute last shred of arrogant East Coast confidence, he relentlessly called the corporate number listed on the document until a receptionist finally agreed to schedule an emergency 15-minute hardship hearing for the following afternoon. The drive into Manhattan the next morning was agonizing. George and Martha rode in total silence in their cheap, smoke-scented rental car. The shiny, leased luxury vehicles had already been aggressively towed away from their driveway during the night. They parked in a massive underground garage they could barely afford and took the elevator up to the 60th floor of a towering glass skyscraper. When the elevator doors chimed open, the sheer intimidating scale of the corporate environment immediately crushed whatever fragile confidence George had left. The reception area was an expansive, ultra-modern fortress of polished black marble and brushed steel. They were not greeted like wealthy country club VIPs. They were treated like absolute nobodies. A cold, efficient security guard scanned their cheap driver licenses and directed them to wait in a sterile, glass-walled boardroom overlooking the sprawling city skyline. The boardroom was freezing. Martha sat rigidly in a sleek leather chair, nervously twisting the fabric of her worn cardigan. Her expensive makeup could not hide the deep dark circles under her terrified eyes. George stood near the massive floor-to-ceiling window, sweating profusely through his oldest, tightest suit. He kept muttering to himself, desperately rehearsing his pathetic financial pitch. He planned to aggressively leverage his past corporate reputation, beg for a 90-day grace period, and promise massive interest returns he could never possibly deliver. He was fully prepared to grovel on his hands and knees to whatever faceless, ruthless corporate executive walked through those doors. Exactly 10 minutes past the hour, the heavy frosted glass double doors finally clicked open. George immediately spun around, pasting a desperate, highly fabricated smile onto his pale face. He extended his right hand, completely ready to introduce himself to the savior of his suburban existence. But his hand froze entirely in midair. His manufactured smile instantly vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. I walked slowly into the freezing boardroom. I was not wearing the simple neutral tones they were used to. I was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal gray executive suit and a pair of intimidating stiletto heels that clicked with absolute authority against the polished floor. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, unforgiving style, and my eyes held absolutely no trace of the subservient daughter they had bullied for 34 years. Martha let out a strangled, pathetic gasp, pressing both of her hands tightly over her mouth. She shrank back into the expensive leather chair as if she had just seen a ghost. George stood completely paralyzed, his extended hand trembling violently, before dropping limply to his side. I did not offer a polite greeting. I did not ask how their drive was. I walked directly to the head of the massive glass conference table and dropped a thick, heavy red folder onto the smooth surface. The loud smack echoed sharply through the silent room. I slowly unclasped the folder and spread the documents out across the table. They were the original fully executed mortgage contracts for their Connecticut estate. "What are you doing here, Diana?" George finally choked out, his voice barely a terrified whisper. He looked frantically past me, staring at the open doorway, as if expecting the real executive to step inside and apologize for the interruption. "Where is the managing director of Vanguard Holdings?" I reached out and placed my index finger directly onto the top document right next to the massive, bold corporate logo. Vanguard Holdings is a subsidiary asset management firm. I stated, my voice completely cold and level. It is entirely owned and operated by Apex Prime. And as you already learned in California, I am Apex Prime. George physically stumbled backward, hitting the glass wall behind him. His eyes darted wildly from my face to the red folder on the table. "When my financial algorithms flagged your property entering pre-foreclosure status due to Andres' massive fraudulent loans," I did not hesitate. I continued, smoothly maintaining absolute, terrifying eye contact. "I personally authorized my acquisitions team to purchase your toxic debt from the regional bank at a premium cash rate. I did not do it to save you. I did it because I wanted to hold the physical paper that proves I own the very roof over your heads. I am your absolute sole creditor. I am the landlord of your ruin." "You planned this," Martha sobbed hysterically, burying her face in her hands. "You orchestrated this entire thing just to destroy us." "I did not make Andre commit bank fraud," I corrected her sharply. "I did not force you to sign away your equity. I simply bought the inevitable outcome. You came here today begging for a grace period. You came here to ask a faceless corporation for mercy." I leaned slightly over the glass table, closing the distance between myself and the man who had ordered me to pack my bags in 60 minutes just a few short months ago. "There is no grace period," I whispered. "You have exactly 24 hours to pack your life and surrender your keys." I paused, watching the absolute devastation wash over their pale faces. The silence in the freezing glass boardroom was so heavy it felt completely suffocating. Martha was shaking uncontrollably, her expensive diamond rings clinking loudly against the mahogany armrests of her chair. George looked as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of his lungs. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg for a sliver of the mercy he had never once shown me, but I raised my hand to stop him. "Actually," I corrected myself, my voice echoing sharply off the cold corporate walls. "24 hours is entirely too generous. And frankly, it does not align with the strict standard operating procedures you established for this family." I reached down to the floor beside my pristine leather chair. I lifted two heavy objects and placed them firmly onto the massive glass conference table. I pushed them forward. They slid across the smooth, polished surface with a harsh, grating scrape, coming to a dead stop exactly in front of my father's trembling hands. George and Martha stared at the objects in pure, unadulterated shock. They were two battered, faded brown suitcases. The zippers were slightly frayed, and the cheap fabric was worn dangerously thin at the corners. They were the exact same cheap luggage bags my mother had dragged out of the hall closet and aggressively dropped at my feet 3 months ago. I had kept them. I had instructed my private security team to retrieve them from the Malibu estate and ship them directly to my Manhattan office for this exact moment. You gave me these when you threw me out into a freezing rainstorm, I reminded them, my tone completely devoid of anger or vindictiveness. It was just a cold, hard statement of fact. You told me I needed tough love. You told me you were not running a charity. You told me that tossing me onto the street with absolutely nothing was the motivation I desperately needed to finally get my life together. I leaned forward, resting my manicured hands on the red mortgage folder. Well, George, consider this my final gift to you. I am returning your brilliant financial philosophy. Martha let out a hollow, agonizing wail. She reached out and touched the frayed handle of the brown suitcase, finally understanding the inescapable poetry of her own absolute ruin. We are your parents, Diana. Martha wept bitterly, her tears completely ruining her pristine makeup. You cannot do this. We have an entire house full of expensive furniture. We have decades of memories. We have irreplaceable antiques. How are we supposed to fit our entire lives into two cheap bags? Where are we supposed to go? That sounds like a complex logistical problem for your financial advisor, I replied effortlessly. Though I suppose Andre is currently unavailable to assist you with your moving arrangements. I stood up to my full height, straightening my charcoal gray executive jacket. The air in the room felt incredibly light to me now. The massive, suffocating weight of their constant approval, their endless criticisms, and their toxic manipulation was completely gone. I did not feel the need to yell. I did not feel the need to hurl insults or demand apologies. Their complete financial and social destruction was the only apology I would ever need. I pulled back the sleeve of my blazer and casually glanced down at the heavy gold Rolex resting on my wrist. The second hand swept smoothly across the diamond-encrusted dial. The house belongs to me now, I stated with absolute terrifying finality. I have a demolition crew scheduled to arrive at the property first thing on Monday morning to level the entire estate and prepare the land for a new commercial development. I am completely erasing that miserable house from the map. You will leave your house keys on the kitchen counter. You will take only what fits in those two suitcases. Everything else belongs to Apex Prime. George stared at me, his eyes completely dead. He finally realized that there was absolutely no negotiation, no hidden loophole, and no wealthy country club friend coming to save him. He was entirely at the mercy of the daughter he had spent a lifetime destroying. Please, he whispered, a broken, pathetic sound escaping his throat. You have exactly 60 minutes to pack your things, I said, delivering the exact same crushing blow he had delivered to me. Your 60 minutes starts right now. I did not wait for a response. I did not want to watch them cry. I simply turned my back on my sobbing parents, picked up my leather briefcase, and walked toward the frosted glass double doors. The heavy doors swung open, and I stepped out into the bustling, high-powered corporate reception area. The sounds of my billion-dollar empire surrounded me. Phones were ringing, executives were closing massive deals, and my security team was standing by, ready to escort me to my next victory. I walked down the long, polished marble hallway without looking back a single time. I pressed the glowing call button for the private executive elevator. The silver doors chimed and slid open instantly. I stepped inside the mirrored cab and turned around. Through the long glass corridor, I could still see the boardroom in the distance. George and Martha were slumped over the massive conference table, clutching the cheap brown suitcases, weeping uncontrollably into the empty corporate void. I pressed the button for the lobby. The heavy silver doors smoothly slid shut, completely cutting off the pathetic sight of my former family. The elevator rapidly descended, carrying me down from the towering skyscraper and out into the bright, endless possibilities of my new, brilliantly free life.